Hello everybody. Welcome and welcome to the Saroy channel this evening. What a lovely evening it is. And I've got a very exciting story in store for you. And it comes to us from Anthea, who's written to us all the way from Colorado. And it's a stunning story, so let's get started. She writes here, "Dear Sarah, I have to say you are right. I'm itching to talk about my Bigfoot encounter, but frankly, I've never had the guts to tell anyone for fear of being judged. You see, I grew up in a very small town where everybody knows everybody else's business and word gets around fast. So believe me, I've kept my lips shut for as long as I can remember. I would not be telling you my story without the assurance of remaining anonymous. And so I'm truly grateful for this opportunity to tell you what happened to me. I was only a little girl in the early 80s when I had my Bigfoot encounter. We lived in a rural community with neighbouring farms, but our little house overlooked a backdrop of large open forest, literally 100 yards from our home. I came from a single-parent home as my dad died when I was only 2 years old, and so my mother had to support us with her meagre income. She would work in a breakfast canteen every day, serving the locals breakfast and lunches, but she was always home in the evenings, which I was immensely grateful for. My grandmother would look after me during the day, and she was a no-nonsense sort of lady with grey curly hair and the most dreadful eyesight you could ever imagine. She hated wearing her glasses, and she was so scatty she was always losing them, and so she seldom ever wore them and simply made do with limited vision. Every day my grandmother would insist that I would have some kind of outdoor exercise, whether it was swinging on my swing set in the backyard or simply going for a small stroll with her around the town and saying hello to all the locals, or dropping in to say hello to my mother on her shift. I have to say that I do not remember much about being 7 years old, but I do remember my encounter with the hairy monster as if it was yesterday, because it is seared in my memory for life. I do remember it was a bitterly cold day in early November when I was playing on my swing set. I loved to glide on my swing set up and down into the air. As a young kid, it was the most exhilarating feeling for me. It was on this particular day that I noticed a shadowy dark figure peeking at me from behind a white pine tree. And then he showed himself, and I screamed and went running into the house to call my granny. "There's a hairy monster watching me. I think he's going to eat me," I cried. On this day, as would be expected, my grandmother could not find her glasses, and so she peered out into the distance to where I was pointing. The hairy man stood there. He didn't move. He was motionless, as if he was a tree, but he continued to stare at me. I could see that he was covered with black hair. I could not see the details of his face, but I definitely felt his stare go right through me, although I cannot say that that he was malevolent in any way. Or in his demeanour, it was rather his reaction to me that was fearful. It was rather my reaction to him that was fearful. All I knew was that he was enormous, bipedal, definitely humanoid and hairy, and most certainly not a bear. My grandmother told me that I was being silly, and where I was pointing was particularly thick dark tree, and it was nothing else. "Granny, you cannot see," I protested. "I promise you I see a monster." But she dismissed me and took me into the house scolding me. "You just don't want to be in the cold." When my mother got home, she scolded me too and told me that my gran was right. "You just don't want to be in the cold. That's why you made up all these stories, so that you could come back into the warm house." "I keep telling you," she protested, "that I grew up in Alaska, and I know that the cold is invigorating. It's really good for you. You'll develop a great immune system. You need to face the elements. It really does you heaps of good." So despite my continuous protesting, I was regulated to the backyard every day for a bout of fresh air and to play on my swing set. Every day that winter, I would see the Bigfoot staring at me, and over time I got used to him just watching me on my swing set. When he was not there, I kind of missed him in a funny way, because he became part of my daily scenery, if you know what I mean. Looking back, I think he was curious, and that maybe he liked children and enjoyed watching me. Who knows? I remember telling one of my friends to come and see the hairy monster at my home, and my friend screamed and told her parents that there was a monster at my house. And so my mother was livid with me for deliberately making up all these horrible stories to scare my friends. "If you carry on this way," she warned me, "you'll have no friends coming to play with you." But it's true," I protested. "There really is a hairy monster in the wood." But my protest always landed on deaf ears. One morning, my mother appeared to be in a big state. I'd never seen her like that before. She seemed to be fussing at something outside my window, looking at some footprints that she saw in the snow, with a look of worry on her face. Afterwards, she would insist that I slept in her room with her until she had finally fixed the latch on my window. I found out when I was older that there had been these gargantuan footprints outside my window, the size of that no human could possibly make. My mother knew then that perhaps my stories about the monster had not been made up. And later, when I was older, we talked about the events of that time. Then she reached out for her jewelry box and brought out a single white marble. It was very beautiful. "I think your Bigfoot friend left you this," she said. "It was placed on your mantel the day I found those humongous footprints in the snow under your window, and there were nose marks pressed against the glass, and your window was at least 7 foot high from the ground. I do not think he was going to harm you, and I do believe your story. But I want you to promise me one thing," she said. "Not a word of this hairy man to anyone, because people will gossip, and it can get nasty, the things that people say." To this day, I still have that marble that Bigfoot left me, and I feel it is my connection to the hairy man. I know some people have had horrid encounters with him, but in my heart, he is my friend, and I really believe he wanted to be my friend too. Since then, I've never had another encounter. I moved away from my small town and now live in Colorado, but I will never forget the day that Bigfoot left me a white marble. Thank you so much for that lovely, lovely story, and until next time, good night.